Welcome to G Fun Facts Online. Today we're looking back at a conflict that lasted less than a week, but whose shockwaves are still felt over half a century later. In just 132 hours, the map of the Middle East was redrawn, and the future of a region was altered forever. This is the story of the 1967 Six-Day War. The stage was set long before June 1967. The animosity from Israel's creation in 1948 had never faded. The 1960s saw rising tensions, with Syrian-backed Palestinian militants, known as Fedayeen, launching raids into Israel, and Israel responding with force. The Cold War added another layer of danger. The Soviet Union armed and supported Egypt and Syria, while the United States began to build its strategic relationship with Israel. A regional dispute was becoming a global proxy battle. The final slide into war began in the spring of 1967. In April, an air battle over the Golan Heights saw Israel shoot down 6 Syrian MiG fighter jets. In response, the Soviets passed false intelligence to Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser, claiming Israel was preparing a massive invasion of Syria. Nasser, a towering figure in the Arab world, felt immense pressure to act. He was often accused of hiding behind the UN peacekeepers stationed in the Sinai Peninsula since the 1956 Suez Crisis. So, on May 14th, he ordered his troops into the Sinai. 4 days later, he demanded the UN forces leave. And to the world's surprise, UN Secretary-General U Thant agreed almost immediately. The buffer was gone. The most critical step came on May 22nd. Nasser announced the closure of the Straits of Tiran to all Israeli shipping. This blockaded Israel's southern port of Eilat, cutting off its vital trade route to Asia and Africa. Israel had publicly stated this would be an act of war. The Arab world was electrified. Jordan's King Hussein, initially hesitant, signed a defense pact with Egypt. Iraq soon followed. As Arab armies massed on its borders, Israel felt its very existence was at stake. After a last-ditch diplomatic effort by the U.S. failed, the Israeli cabinet, with the legendary general Moshe Dayan now as defense minister, made a fateful decision: a preemptive strike. At 7:45 a.m. on June 5, 1967, the war began with one of the most successful air attacks in history, Operation Focus. In a series of meticulously planned waves, nearly 200 Israeli jets flew under the radar to strike 18 Egyptian airfields. Within just a few hours, the Egyptian Air Force was annihilated on the ground. Israel then turned its attention to the air forces of Jordan, Syria, and even Iraq, crippling them as well. By the end of the first day, Israel had achieved total air supremacy. The ground forces now had a clear sky above them, a factor that would prove absolutely decisive. With the sky secured, Israeli ground troops poured into the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip. The main Egyptian defenses were concentrated at a heavily fortified complex called Abu Agela. Here, Israeli Major General Ariel Sharon unleashed a textbook example of modern warfare. In a complex night attack, he coordinated paratroopers dropped by helicopter behind enemy lines, with tanks, infantry, and artillery in a concentric assault. The attack shattered the Egyptian defenses. Hearing of the fall of Abu Agela, the Egyptian high command panicked and ordered a general retreat. This retreat quickly turned into a chaotic rout. Israeli forces pursued the fleeing Egyptians across the desert, inflicting huge casualties. By the 4th day of the war, Israeli tanks were parked on the banks of the Suez Canal. The entire Sinai Peninsula was under their control. Meanwhile, on the Central Front, Israel had sent a message to Jordan's King Hussein, urging him to stay out of the fighting. But Nasser, in a disastrous miscalculation, told Hussein that Egypt was winning spectacularly. Believing him, Jordan began shelling Israeli-held West Jerusalem. Israel's response was immediate. The IDF counterattacked into the West Bank. The fighting for Jerusalem was ferocious. One of the key battles took place at a fortified Jordanian position called Ammunition Hill. Israeli paratroopers engaged in brutal, close-quarters combat, fighting bunker to bunker through a network of trenches. It was a bloody victory, costing 36 Israeli and 71 Jordanian lives, but it opened the path to the Old City. On June 7th, the third day of the war, came the moment that would define the conflict for many. Israeli paratroopers broke through the Lion's Gate into the Old City of Jerusalem. The brigade commander, Mata Gur, famously broadcast the message, "The Temple Mount is in our hands." I repeat, the Temple Mount is in our hands. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, Jews had access to their holiest site, the Western Wall. The images of battle-hardened soldiers weeping at the ancient stones became iconic. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan arrived and declared, "We have returned to the holiest of our holy places, never to part from it again." Within 2 days of entering the war, Jordan had lost control of the entire West Bank, including East Jerusalem. The final front was the Golan Heights. For the first 4 days, Syria, which had been a major cause of the pre-war tension, mostly limited itself to shelling Israeli towns from its heavily fortified positions on the heights. But with Egypt and Jordan defeated and the shelling continuing, the Israeli leadership decided to act. On June 9th, the 5th day, Dayan gave the order. The IDF launched an incredibly difficult uphill assault against the entrenched Syrian defenses. After a grueling battle, Israeli forces broke through. The Syrian army collapsed into a full retreat. By the time a UN ceasefire took hold on the evening of June 10th, Israel had captured the strategic Golan Heights. The 6-day war was over. The military victory was overwhelming, but the cost was still high. Israel lost nearly 1,000 soldiers. Arab losses were catastrophic, with estimates reaching over 20,000 casualties combined for Egypt, Jordan, and Syria. The territorial consequences were staggering. Israel had captured the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, quadrupling the territory under its control. This new map created a whole new set of intractable problems. The legacy of those 6 days continues to shape the Middle East. The first major consequence was the occupation. The capture of the West Bank, the biblical Judea and Samaria, and Jerusalem's holy sites sparked a movement to establish Jewish settlements in the newly acquired territories. Initially small-scale, the settlement enterprise expanded dramatically after 1977 and has become a central and deeply contentious obstacle to peace, considered illegal under international law by many. The second major consequence was the transformation of Palestinian nationalism. The crushing defeat of the Arab armies shattered the hope that they would liberate Palestine. This led to the rise of an independent Palestinian movement. The Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO, previously an Egyptian puppet, was taken over by Yasser Arafat's Fatah faction. The war placed over 1 million Palestinians under Israeli rule and created a new wave of refugees, fueling the ranks of the PLO and solidifying the Palestinian identity as a separate national movement. In an attempt to forge peace from the ashes of war, the UN Security Council passed Resolution 242 in November 1967. It established the principle that has guided all future negotiations: land for peace. The resolution called for Israeli withdrawal from occupied territories in exchange for peace and secure, recognized boundaries for all states in the region. However, a single missing word in the English text has caused decades of dispute. It calls for withdrawal from territories occupied, not the territories occupied. Israel has long interpreted this to mean it doesn't need to withdraw from all the territory. The Arab states, pointing to the French version which is more explicit, insist it means a full withdrawal. This deliberate ambiguity has been a permanent sticking point. For Israel, the victory brought euphoria and a sense of invincibility, but also the long-term corrosive moral and political challenges of being an occupying power. For the Arab world, the defeat, known as the Naksa or setback, was a profound trauma that shattered the dream of pan-Arab unity. The war also had huge economic effects. Egypt closed the Suez Canal for 8 years, forcing global shipping on a long and expensive trip around Africa and even spurring the development of larger supertankers. The 1967 war was not an end, but a beginning. It led directly to the War of Attrition along the Suez Canal and was a primary cause of the 1973 Yom Kippur War. While that later conflict eventually led to a peace treaty with Egypt, the core issues created in 1967, the occupation, the settlements, the status of Jerusalem, and the fate of the Palestinians remain unresolved. The Six-Day War was a turning point that locked the region into a new, more complex and seemingly endless cycle of conflict. The questions raised in those 132 hours are the very same questions that define the struggle for the Holy Land today. Thanks for listening to Fun Facts Online.